From the Soviet and Afghan dispositions, I was able to deduce several tentative conclusions upon which to base my own strategic thinking for the prosecution of the war. First, the Soviets were by and large content to hold a series of major military bases or strategic towns, and the routes between them, which indicated a mainly static defensive posture. They did not seem to want to occupy large tracts of countryside. Second, they attached great importance to the Kabul-Bagram complex and all approaches to it. Third, the provinces north of the Hindu Kush were critical to the Soviets for strategic, the Salang Highway ran through them, economic, gas, oil, and mineral-producing regions, and political, the same people lived on either side of the border. Fourth, West and SW Afghanistan were not critical to the Soviets. Apart from the protection of Shidand, which, as a major airbase, directly threatened the Persian Gulf, this part of the country was probably only considered as a buffer zone between themselves and Iran. Provided their road linked north to Kushka via Herat, upon which the Afghan 17th Division was based, was kept open, they would be happy. The Soviet forces had been in Afghanistan for 4 years, yet there was no evidence that they wished to escalate the war in terms of numbers. Despite the fact that they had underestimated the Mujahedin and overestimated the capacity of the Afghan army, they seemed content with improving their tactics, rationalizing their forces, developing the use of air power, bolstering their Afghan allies, and introducing more suitable weapons. In fact, trying desperately to improve the quality of their troops rather than the quantity. I felt that they must realize that if they wanted to overrun the entire country quickly, then they would need to triple the size of their forces inside Afghanistan. In 1964, the US had 16,000 men in Vietnam, yet within 5 years this figure had skyrocketed to over 500,000 in an attempt to smother the opposition. The Soviets were not following the American example in this respect. I suspected that the reasons for this were more political and economic than military. Internationally, the Soviets had been vehemently condemned for their invasion. It had soured steadily improving relations with both the West and China, so to triple the size of their army in Afghanistan would certainly heighten the political outcry against the Soviet Union and boost the resolve of the US and others to sustain the Mujahedin. Economically, the war was an enormous drain. Gorbachev was later to call it a bleeding wound. Not only with the Soviets funding their own forces, but with the local economy in ruins, they had to fund the Afghan government and army as well. Then, as their scorched earth strategy took effect and refugees swarmed into Kabul and other large cities, they had to provide food for thousands of civilians. Billions of rubles were needed from an already flawed Soviet economy. It was estimated that $12 million a day were required to keep the country and its war ticking over. Drastically to enlarge the strength of the occupying troops would be asking too much. In practical terms, such an increase would have needed a much improved supply line north to Kabul, and one that was not subject to frequent attacks. The Salang Highway could not meet these requirements. All this was of some encouragement to me. If the enemy was fully committed militarily, then I knew exactly what we were up against. If there was unlikely to be massive reinforcement, I surmised the Soviets might have no trumps in their hand. I already knew there was a political as well as military side to the Soviet strategy. The Kremlin, and indeed the Soviet General Staff, understood the fundamental truth that without Pakistan, the jihad was doomed. When President Zia, acting on the urging of General Kokhtar, offered Pakistan as a secure base area, he condemned the Soviets to a prolonged counterinsurgency campaign that they were ill-prepared to fight. Like all armies, guerrilla forces cannot survive indefinitely without adequate bases to which they can withdraw from time to time to rest and refit. They need the means with which to fight, they need resupplying, they need to train, and they need intelligence. Pakistan provided all these things to the Mujahedin. For the Soviets, this was extremely frustrating. By 1983, they had launched a well-coordinated campaign to make the cost to Pakistan of supporting the Afghan resistance progressively higher. Their aim was to undermine President Zia and his policies by a massive subversion and sabotage effort based on the use of thousands of KHAD agents and informers. Every KHAD bomb in a Pakistan bazaar, every shell that landed inside Pakistan, every Soviet or Afghan aircraft that infringed Pakistan's airspace, and there were hundreds of them, every weapon that was distributed illegally to the border tribes, and every fresh influx of refugees was aimed at getting Pakistan to back off. The Soviets sought with increasing vigor to foment trouble inside Pakistan. Their agents strove to alienate the Pakistanis from the refugees, whose camps stretched from Chitral in the north all the way to beyond Quetta, almost 2,000 kilometers to the south. The border areas of Pakistan had grown into a vast, sprawling administrative base for the jihad. The Mujahedin came there for arms, they came to rest, they came to settle their families into the camps, they came for training, and they came for medical attention. At the time, we in ISI did not appreciate how fine a line President Zia was treading. As a soldier, I find it hard to believe that the Soviet High Command was not putting powerful pressure on their political leaders to allow them to strike at Pakistan. After all, the Americans had expanded the Vietnam War into Laos and Cambodia, which had been used as secure bases for the Viet Cong. The Soviet Union, however, held back from any serious escalation. I had to ensure that we did not provoke them sufficiently to do so. A war with the Soviets would have been the end of Pakistan and could have unleashed a world war. It was a great responsibility, and one which I had to keep constantly in mind during those years. An interesting example of the sort of incident that could quickly get out of hand or lead to international confrontation involved Soviet prisoners of war and occurred about a year after I arrived at ISI. At that time, a few Soviet prisoners were kept by the parties in their unofficial jails on the outskirts of Peshawar. On this occasion, Rabbani had 35 such captives, along with several suspect KHAD agents, locked up near his warehouse. 3 of these Soviets had been taken prisoner 2 years earlier, and outwardly at least appeared to have accepted Islam, possibly as a way of saving their lives. Because of this, they were not secured or watched vigilantly. One evening, when everyone was at prayers, they overpowered a solitary sentry, took his weapon, and then smashed the armory door to get more. After clambering onto the roof, they demanded to be handed over to the Soviet embassy. Their captors did not agree. A long night was spent with the Soviets on the roof, surrounded by well-armed Mujahedin. In the morning, Rabbani's military representative tried to reason with them, but as he was doing so, the Soviets spotted some men trying to get closer by a covered approach. The escapees opened up with a 60mm mortar, killing one Mujahedin and wounding others. The battle was joined. Then, without thinking, one Mujahedin fired an RPG-7 into the building, straight into the ammunition store. The explosion shook Peshawar, sending missiles and rockets flying in all directions and shredding the Soviets and KHAD agents. Fortunately, although the fireworks display closed the Peshawar Kohat road, no civilians were injured. The Soviet press got wind of what had happened and later described the incident as a heroic last stand against impossible odds, with the prisoners killing scores of the enemy before being overwhelmed. Our government was highly embarrassed, as they always emphatically denied holding Soviet prisoners in Pakistan. We received explicit orders that all such prisoners must be held in Afghanistan. We had learned a lesson at the cost of a valuable arms dump and allowing the water to come perilously near the boil. 1983 had been a comparatively quiet year in the field as far as the Soviets were concerned. There were no Soviet divisional offensive sweeps similar to those launched the previous year around Herat and in the Panjshir Valley. Nevertheless, I was able to study a regimental-sized operation, which gave me some inkling.
On 26 November, long columns of armored personnel carriers, tanks, and trucks drove north up the Salong Highway from Khair Hana camp on the outskirts of Kabul, see Map 4. They belonged to the 180th MRR of the Soviet 108th MRD. With them went Afghan army units and helicopter gunships. The Soviet High Command had been stung by the endless attacks on convoys using this critical lifeline from the north. To the west of this road, the massif, called the Ko-i-Pagman, rose up in places to over 12,000 feet. It was cut by several narrow east-west valleys that provided the Mujahedin with perfect covered approaches to and from the highway from their bases in the mountains. Each valley had its tiny villages, with a larger one at the entrance, from which movement up and down the main road could be readily observed. The Soviets resolved to have a final attempt to clear 3 of these valleys before winter set in. From the equipment and weapons carried, they appeared to have learned some expensive lessons. Always edgy, always sensitive to sniper fire and ambushes at close range in the defiles, many troops now wore bulky metal plate flak jackets. Special anti-sniper squads had been created to pinpoint marksmen. The firepower of the platoon had been boosted by the issue of the new AK-74 rifle, some with a single-shot 40mm grenade launcher attached under the barrel, 30mm automatic grenade launchers with a range out to 800 meters, and a high proportion of RPGs. Some platoons were being equipped with a highly demoralizing incendiary weapon. It resembled a bazooka and fired a shell up to 200 meters, which exploded into a fireball on hitting the target. The standard APC of the MRD was the BTR-60, which mounted a 14.5mm heavy machine gun, a fine weapon provided the gunner could bring it to bear on his target. Often he could not, as his enemy had the disconcerting habit of overlooking him from high up steep slopes. Try as he might, the gunner could not elevate his gun sufficiently to engage. A 30-degree maximum elevation was perfect for the flat plains or undulating hills of Europe, but useless in the defiles of Afghanistan. By 1983, a workable solution had been improvised. Twin 23mm AA guns were fixed to the rear of a heavy-duty truck to give the required high rate of accurate fire at any angle up to the almost vertical. The Soviet Air Force had learned from their low-level bombing runs. There had been a worryingly high proportion of bombs failing to detonate. The Mujahedin had sometimes used them as a source of explosive. So retard bombs, which had a small parachute attached, were now being employed. They descended more slowly, and thus even at minimal heights gave enough time for the bombs to become armed before hitting the ground. Anti-personnel cluster bombs were another deadly innovation. They contained 60 bomblets, each equivalent to an 81mm mortar bomb. The firepower was awesome, but without sound tactics, it could not of itself bring victory, certainly not against a guerrilla force. The column was split into 3 separate battalion battle groups, each covered by gunships. Within a short distance, the leading battalion swung left off the highway and headed towards the village of Shakadara. 10 kilometers further on, the next battalion turned towards the Farza Valley, and finally the last battalion moved into the Istalef Valley, the northernmost of the 3. The maximum distance traveled by any unit was 25 kilometers, but by nightfall on the 26th, the battalions had merely positioned themselves astride the highway exits to each valley. The Mujahedin in the area were well aware of what was happening. On the subsequent day, the bombing started. Fighter bombers from nearby Bagram screamed up the valleys. Their targets were the people and houses below them. The air attacks, with the crash of 500 IB bombs and palls of black smoke, were intended to kill indiscriminately, to terrify, to destroy houses, and supposedly entrap any Mujahedin who might be in the valleys. On the 28th, more bombers pounded the mountainsides and valley floor as the ground forces began pushing up towards Shakadara, Farza, and Istalef, each of which was shelled and rocketed by gunships to supplement the airstrikes. As is surprisingly little was left when the Soviet troops arrived. Some dead and injured civilians, piles of rubble, a few old men, women, and children who had survived by cowering under rocks. Of the Mujahedin, nothing. The presence of attacking and securing ground continued for another week before the entire force pulled back to Kabul. There was nothing out of the ordinary in this comparatively small-scale operation. For this very reason, it was illuminating for me. It was typical of Soviet tactics at this stage of the war. Road-bound units, bristling with guns, moved tortuously along the roads and tracks in broad daylight. There was no discernible attempt at surprise. The entire effort was slow-moving and ponderous, enabling the Mujahedin either to fight or disappear at their will. No serious attempt had been made to block the heads of the valleys other than by bombs, and there was not much evidence of coordinating the airstrikes with a swift approach by the ground forces. There was bombing, there was shelling, then there was a ground advance to find out what was left. A search and destroy mission with not much searching but a lot of destruction of buildings. No effort was made to position a proper cordon by using helicopters. The Soviets seemed to be content to stay in their vehicles for the most part, and when they did dismount, it was usually only to sift through the debris wrought by high explosive on mud and brick. After a few days of this, everybody had gone back, chalking up another victory for official reports. It reminded me of the boxer with his punch bag. Just so long as the boxer keeps his fist on the bag after making his punch, an impression is maintained. When he removes his fist to strike again elsewhere, the bag resumes its original shape. It was not enough to know where the enemy was, or even to know his strength, weapons, and tactics. I needed knowledge of his morale, his motivations, and his will to fight. My recent studies of the Soviet soldier had left me with a high opinion of his fighting qualities, which was one of the reasons I had been somewhat skeptical of the ability of the Mujahedin to defeat him in the field. The German, Major General von Mellendien, who fought the Russians in 1943, rated their toughness, determination, and willpower second to none. He wrote, "Natural obstacles simply do not exist for him. He is at home in the desert, forest, in swamps and marshes as much as the roadless steppes. He crosses broad rivers by the most primitive means. He can make roads anywhere. In winter, columns 10 men abreast and 100 deep will be sent into forests deeply covered in snow. In half an hour, these 1,000 men will stamp out a path and another 1,000 will take their place. Within a few hours, a road will exist across ground deemed inaccessible by any Western standard." Fortunately, as I was to discover, things had changed a lot in 40 years, and the general had made no mention of mountains. The Soviet soldier in Afghanistan proved to be a different man from his father in the Great Patriotic War, as they called World War II. Then, the Soviets were defending their motherland. The Germans had killed or captured millions, overrun vast stretches of Russia, and driven to the gates of Moscow. The Soviet troops fought with the ferocity and determination of cornered animals. They had no other option. Theirs was a battle for personal and national survival. There is no greater cause. In Afghanistan, things were completely different. The modern Soviet soldier is a conscript. Even his sergeants are the same. He is compelled to enlist at 18 for 2 years. As a conscript recruit, his life is normally miserable, often degrading. Prisoners or deserters described the intensive bullying to which they had to submit from private soldiers only 6 months senior, as well as from many of their officers. The average Soviet had no motivation to fight in Afghanistan other than to survive and go home. He was not defending his homeland, he was the invader, detested by most Afghans, allies or enemy, and badly trained, fed, and accommodated. As the American Vietnam veteran David Parks wrote in GI Diary in 1968, "I never felt I was fighting for any particular cause. I fought to stay alive, and I killed to keep from getting killed." I was quite sure many Soviet conscripts in Afghanistan would have expressed the same sentiments. What puzzled me as a professional soldier was the almost total lack of even basic training given to men who were posted to operational units in the early days of the war. It was quite normal for a recruit to go on operations with only 3 weeks training behind him. Even worse was the prisoner who described how during his first 6 weeks in the army, he was merely given food and a uniform, no weapon, and no training at all. Then he was posted to Afghanistan, to Mazar-e-Sharif, where he was immediately sent on village clearing and house-to-house searches looking for Chinese, American, or Pakistani mercenaries. Initially, as this man explained, he had to rely on his lessons on the AK-47 that he had received as a 12-year-old schoolboy. When it was realized that Soviet units would be needed to spearhead major operations and the Afghan army was totally unreliable, efforts were made to improve training standards, although this did not seemingly improve morale. Reinforcements were held back in the training divisions around Termez, but even this did not obviate the need for continuation training in operational units. The Soviet system did not work well. A conscript was in the army for 2 years, with a new intake arriving every 6 months, and a time-expired group of roughly equal numbers leaving at the same time. Units, which many of whom were under strength anyway, lost their most experienced 25%, which were replaced with completely green recruits who required further training.
Who required further training? As was pointed out to me, this was one of the reasons why Soviet units had so small a proportion of their men available for active operations away from their bases. A regimental commander could seldom, if ever, put his entire regiment in the field. He would have one battalion, note 3, the Soviet soldier, resting and being used as a training unit, another manning static defensive posts, with only his third available for deployment. On examining the figures, I doubted whether more than 10 to 12,000 Soviet troops from their 85,000 inside Afghanistan could have been committed to active operations at any one time. Even these men were in scattered formations, not all concentrated in one area for a major offensive. Although I treated the horror stories of deserters or prisoners with a degree of skepticism, there appeared to be a basis of truth in what they said, if only because so many told the same thing. By and large, the average man from an MRD detested the war, had no enthusiasm for his task, was concerned only with surviving and going home. Living conditions were harsh. Even in Kabul, camps were often tented, with 40 men living in each throughout the winter, packed around a single stove in the center. Those in the middle roasted, those on the outside froze. Lack of hygiene and bathing facilities caused sickness, as did a vitamin-deficient diet. Many Soviets went hungry for much of the time. Their rations were insufficient in quantity and lacked variety. Rarely did they eat fruit or vegetables. These deprivations were exacerbated by a lack of cash. A conscript private with no qualifications or experience received roughly the equivalent of $5 a month. Usually this was spent at once on more food. As well as being bleak and brutal, the existence of many was also boring. The same troops could man the same hilltop outpost for months on end, freezing in winter, baking in the summer. The daily grind of sentry duty, bad food, and boredom caused many to seek solace in drugs or alcohol. Hashish was cheaper and easier to obtain than drink, vodka being a luxury reserved for officers. A Soviet soldier from Estonia was quoted as saying, "Often regular Afghan army soldiers exchanged their Russian arms for food and drink from the peasants. So we did the same thing, because in the chaos of war, to explain the loss of a weapon is easy. We used to buy all kinds of food and drink, and even bread, in exchange for our weapons. Some soldiers got hashish and other drugs. Our Asian soldiers were very often drug addicts because hash and other things grow on their land." For money, the Soviet soldier would sell anything, including weapons and ammunition, despite draconian punishments if the offender was caught. It was hardly surprising, therefore, that these conscripts were reluctant warriors. Often they were loath to quit the comparative security of their bases or to dismount from behind armor plate in the field. Their preferred tactics seemed to be to leave the fighting to the Afghan army, make maximum use of firepower, both ground and air, and stick to the roads as much as possible, only venturing out on foot when the area had been thoroughly strafed and pounded by shells, bombs, and rockets. It was my impression, which I retained throughout my tour, that the Soviets were excessively casualty conscious. This was reflected in the tactics of the senior commanders as well as the actions of individual soldiers. There were exceptions. The paratroop, air assault units fought much more aggressively. These men were all jump-trained before arriving in Afghanistan. Their NCOs had all done 6-month courses.
Their units had better equipment, and their officers were normally of a higher caliber than those in MRDs. In the months following my arrival, the Soviets committed more special operations forces to the conflict. These Spetsnaz, Soviet special forces, were highly trained and motivated. Although the soldiers were conscripts, they were the cream of the national intake. In Afghanistan, they eventually deployed 7 battalions, each of around 250 men, 5 of which were located in the east and 2 in the south of the country. I noticed there was a high proportion of paratroops in the Soviet order of battle, indicating that it was these units that would play a key role in offensive sweeps away from the roads. This was invariably the case, although they deployed to battle in helicopters rather than by parachute. Although the Soviets were my principal target, and it was their withdrawal that was our ultimate goal, most of the time the Mujahedin would be fighting the Afghan army, Afghan against Afghan. At the start of the resistance movement against the communist government in Kabul in 1978-1979, the Afghan army, trained and equipped by the Soviets for many years, was divided against itself. When the government had announced a compulsory literacy campaign for all women in early 1979, it provoked nationwide protests. This was against all the traditions of Afghans. On 15 March 1979, a mob of armed protesters had assembled in the city of Herat. The demonstration rapidly turned into a general uprising of the townsmen and an assault on the prison to release political opponents of the regime. On the 17th, soldiers from the garrison joined in, shooting some of their officers. That day, the entire Afghan 17th Division mutinied, led by Captain Ismail Khan from the anti-aircraft battalion. He subsequently became a leading Mujahedin commander in the Herat area. It was the only occasion that a complete division went over to the resistance with its weapons. In the ensuing chaos, the people vented their hatred on the Soviet military advisors and their families in Herat. Some 50 or more were rounded up, tortured, cut to pieces, and their heads stuck on poles for parading round the city. Government armored reinforcements from Kabul and heavy bombing subsequently retook Herat and smashed the resistance at a cost of 5,000, mostly civilian, lives. It was the start of what I would term the revolving door period of the Afghan army. This period lasted 2 years, during which it was common for whole units to defect to the Mujahedin. As fast as the Kabul government rounded up recruits, even greater numbers deserted, hence the likeness to a revolving door. In 1980, the situation was so desperate that the 9th Division was down to little more than 1,000 men. Commanders confined their men to their bases or within defensive posts, as to take them out on an operation was tantamount to sending them over to the Mujahedin. Wire and mines were laid to keep defenders in as much as attackers out. The Soviet invasion had given the guerrillas what was to prove their largest recruitment boost of the war, as thousands of civilians and soldiers joined what had become a jihad. The arrival of the infidels gave the resistance a cause, transformed the guerrilla fighter into a crusader, a mujahedin, with all that implied. From 100,000 men, the Afghan army shriveled to a mere 25,000. Right up to 1987, when I left ISI, I believe the Afghan army had an annual loss due to desertion, demobilization, and death of around 20,000. Recruitment had to be maintained by press gangs. In theory, conscription was for men aged 18 to 25 for a period of 3 years. But in practice, those from 15 to 55 were often taken. The problem was that the manpower pool from which to take recruits had been cut dramatically by the war. Kabul found it impossible to tap the rural areas outside their control, which only left the larger cities which could provide conscripts. By the end of 1980, severe penalties were imposed to keep men in. For ignoring call-up papers, up to 4 years jail, for absence without leave, up to 5 years, and for desertion, conspiracy against the revolution, and a long list of other offenses, 15 years or execution. Later, the period of service was extended to 4 years, which sparked off several mutinies. I heard of men conscripted twice, even 3 times. Once conscripted, a private had to exist on 200 Afghanis a month, whereas if he had volunteered, he would have got 3,000 to 6,000 Afghanis. Everywhere he went, he was watched. An escort accompanied him to the toilet, and sometimes it was 2 months before he was allowed a weapon at night or ammunition for his rifle. This was the force that the Soviets had expected to go out and fight the guerrillas. More often, it had to be locked in to prevent its men joining them. This situation threw the Soviets' initial plan out of gear. I believe now, looking back on it with the benefit of hindsight, that 1980 was the year in which the Mujahedin could have won the war. It was the period in which they received the most recruits from a population 9/10 opposed to communism. It was the period in which the Soviets found themselves ill-equipped, ill-trained, and disinclined to mount counterinsurgency operations, and they were also under immense international pressure as aggressors. And it was the time that the Afghan army was almost totally useless as a military force. In combination, these factors could have proved fatal to the communists. They did not, for 2 reasons. Firstly, the Mujahedin did not combine quickly to take advantage of their enemy's weakness. Secondly, they were not being supplied with sufficient weapons designed to engage tanks, APCs, and aircraft. The supply pipeline through Pakistan was not yet functioning at anything like the capacity of the mid-1980s. The Soviets and the Kabul government were given time to put their house in order, which they partially succeeded in doing. Thereafter, success for the jihad was that much more elusive and time-consuming, but still far from impossible.
By 1983, the Afghan army was functioning again as a viable force. Its dispositions down to divisional level are shown on Map 3, but none of them exceeded 5,000 men, making them at best brigades as far as numbers were concerned. One division, the 7th in Kabul, could only muster 1,000, while battalions of 200 were not uncommon. Nevertheless, the total strength of the army had climbed back up to 35,000 to 40,000 men. It was being utilized in the field to a limited extent, and the Soviets were using it to fight the war along the Pakistan border. All the minor posts and garrisons in the east were manned by Afghans. In theory, the Afghan High Command worked alongside the Soviets, there supposedly being a partnership to run the war. In practice, this was nonsense, as all strategic and most tactical decisions were made by the Soviets. A Soviet military advisor looked over his Afghan opposite number's shoulder from the headquarters of 40th Army in Kabul down to every isolated company post throughout the 29 provinces. An Afghan officer disregarded his advisor at his peril. There seemed to be a widening rift between Soviet and Afghan commanders, with the former regarding the latter as a second-rate, even expendable ally. I was later to read transcripts of intercepted radio messages in which Afghan officers complained that they were being ordered to undertake risky, dangerous missions, while the Soviets remained secure in base. I was certain there was little love lost between the two, although troth parties realized neither could survive without the other, so they kept up a presence of fraternal cooperation. I was especially keen to understand what was happening in the air. Air power was assuredly the enemy's greatest asset. It bestowed not only unlimited firepower, but also mobility. Used correctly, these two could be combined on the battlefield to defeat the guerrillas tactically, if not strategically. The problem from the Mujahedin's point of view was not so much that they had no air power of their own, but that their means of striking back at enemy planes and helicopters was restricted to a few outdated SA-7 shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles, SAMs. I will discuss this deficiency and the air war in detail in a later chapter, but I would make the point here, as it was made to me on my arrival at ISI, that this lack of an effective and suitable anti-aircraft weapon was the most serious defect in the Mujahedin's armory. This situation was not to be remedied for another 3 years. Discounting at least 4 helicopter regiments, the air map depicted Bagram Air Base as having the largest concentration with 54 fighter and fighter-bomber aircraft. Next was Shindand in the west with 45, and then Kandahar with 15. These planes were outnumbered by those stationed in the Soviet Union, but which regularly carried out sorties over Afghanistan.
At that time, our intelligence was showing 195 such aircraft based at Mary North, Karshi-Khanabad, Kokaiti, and Chirchek, this latter being 350 kilometers north of the Amu, see Map 5. As was explained to me, the Soviet fixed-wing aircraft were being used to attack villages which might be serving as Mujahedin bases. Close air support, that is, attacking guerrillas in contact with communist ground troops, was limited. This task was invariably given to helicopter gunships rather than fighter bombers. Heavy use of bombing in localized areas was a common way of exacting reprisals after a successful guerrilla ambush. Indiscriminate bombing was causing great destruction of villages and inflicting hundreds of civilian casualties. It did not normally do much harm to the Mujahedin, but it was the primary cause of the torrent of refugees flowing into Pakistan. I suppose this in itself was counted as a success by the Soviets, as the refugees became a growing source of discontent in Pakistan. The Mujahedin feared the helicopter rather than the MiG or the Su-17, because he could not hit back at it. It had become a personal enemy, spitting shells at him from a few thousand feet with comparative impunity. The Mi-24 Hind gunship was the Soviets' battlefield workhorse of the war. Its armaments could include 12.7mm machine guns, 57mm rockets, HE, white phosphorus and incendiary bombs, airdropped minelet pods, cluster bombs, or chemical canisters. By late 1983, working in pairs, they could be seen providing close air support, rocketing villages, flying as convoy escorts, and patrolling and destroying whatever they could find moving below them. As a transport helicopter, the Mi-8 or Mi-17 of the HIP series predominated. They were beginning to be used more effectively to airland troops into blocking or cutoff positions during the larger sweep operations. By mid-November, I felt more confident that I was beginning to understand the Mujahedin and their enemies. It was time to consult General Akhtar on an overall long-term strategy for the war. We needed to decide priorities, to agree how best to improve the ability of the Mujahedin to defeat a superpower. Another Vietnam. There were 58,000, note 4, in Vietnam, and we owe the Russians one. I have a slight obsession with it because of Vietnam, thought the Soviets ought to get a dose of it. Congressman Charles Wilson, formerly an avid supporter of U.S. assistance to the Mujahedin, as quoted in the Daily Telegraph, 14 January 1985. I arranged Wilson's visit into Afghanistan in 1987. It was something he had always wanted to do, as he had been an energetic and persuasive spokesman for the Mujahedin cause inside the House of Representatives for a number of years. He had proved a good supporter of the jihad and was well known to President Zia, to whom he had casually let slip that he was going inside Afghanistan. Zia, who was not aware that this had been arranged, kept a straight face, but later sought out General Akhtar and forbade it. He did so for political reasons, in case news of it were to leak, and because of the slight risk of him becoming a casualty or, much worse, taken prisoner. Zia wanted the water warm, not boiling hot. Wilson had also arrived with a lady friend who he hoped would accompany him, but this would have proved embarrassing and risky to arrange. Wilson had arranged his visit directly with Hollis Party.
He, President. Although Zia vetoed the visit, he was adamant that Wilson should not know that he or ISI had prevented it. We concocted a plan whereby Wilson be allowed to approach the border and then be stopped by Mujahedin on the pretext of intertribal fighting in the vicinity. This worked, and I went to Peshawar to escort him back to Islamabad. When he saw General Akhtar, he was told that if he came back secretly, arrangements would be made to get him into Afghanistan. Wilson duly returned and visited the Mujahedin base at Jawar, some 5 kilometers into Afghanistan, opposite Miram Shah, see Map 1. There he enjoyed himself, being photographed on a white pony dressed as a Mujahedin with a bandolier of bullets across his chest. He was most excited when he came under spasmodic shell fire, although nothing landed closer than 200 meters.
Because we had several Stingers with us, we tried to tempt a helicopter to come within range, as the Mujahedin wanted to show off their skill, and Wilson was equally enthusiastic to see one brought down. Unfortunately, they kept well away. On his return, he was furious that the U.S. Embassy had, somewhat thoughtlessly, arranged for him to fly home via Moscow. He made a monumental fuss and refused to board the aircraft, so another flight had to be found for him. I still have his letter of thanks for this covert trip to the war. I mention this now because Wilson epitomized the attitude of many American officials that I met that Afghanistan must be made into a Soviet Vietnam. The Soviets had kept the Viet Cong supplied with the hardware to fight and kill Americans, so the US would now do the same for the Mujahedin so they could kill Soviets. This view was similarly prevalent among CIA officers, including particularly the director, William Casey. I could see they were deeply resentful of their failure to win in Vietnam, which had been a major military defeat for the world's leading superpower. To me, getting their own back seemed to be the primary reason for the US backing the war with so much money. I have no doubt that the State Department had many valid strategic and political reasons for US support, but I am merely emphasizing that many American officials appeared to regard it as a God-given opportunity to kill Soviets without any US lives being endangered. General Akhtar agreed with them that the war could be turned into a Soviet Vietnam. He had convinced the president it was entirely feasible, and now it was my job to see it carried out. Certainly, it seemed there were numerous similarities between the two wars. At the political level, both involved superpowers fighting in a foreign country on the Asian continent. In both cases, they fought to prop up a government that was corrupt and unpopular with the majority of the population. In both Vietnam and Afghanistan, huge, modern, conventional forces fought, at least initially, a guerrilla force. And in both instances, the superpower fatally underestimated their enemy, considering, at the outset, speedy victory within their grasp. Strategically, the terrain favored the guerrillas in both countries, with the jungle-covered mountains of Vietnam and the high, barren, rocky mountains of Afghanistan providing refuge and cover from the air to the insurgents. Both the US and Soviet Union relied heavily on air power to compensate for their inability to meet their enemies on equal terms on the ground. For the conventional armies, it was primarily a defensive war on land, with each trying to retain control over cities, communication centers, towns, and strategic military bases, leaving the rural areas to the guerrillas. Both wars saw the use of terror and the indiscriminate bombing of villages which were supposedly sheltering the enemy. The guerrillas in Vietnam could obtain reinforcements, supplies, and sanctuary across the borders in Laos and Cambodia, while the Mujahedin sought the same in Pakistan. At the tactical level, the superpowers depended heavily on firepower rather than infantry manpower to destroy their elusive opponents. Both relearned the lesson that this tactic on its own does not defeat the guerrilla. The Americans coined a new military phrase, search and destroy, which became synonymous with surrounding a village or locality, then pounding it from the air and ground irrespective of who was inside the cordon. Afterwards, there was a body count and the units claimed another victory. The Soviets copied this type of haphazard slaughter with great zeal, although they were not so adept at the cordoning. Neither America nor the Soviet Union could have survived as long as they did without the helicopter. But even then, this wonder weapon could not give either the victory they sought. The attitudes of the soldiery of both superpowers developed along remarkably similar lines. Both were largely conscript armies whose men fought with great reluctance in order to survive. They had no interest in the war, no cause with which they could relate. This resulted in poor performance, particularly at small unit level. Morale dropped alarmingly, and many resorted to alcohol or drugs in order to forget. With the Americans, it led to widespread combat refusals and over 1,000 cases of fragging, soldiers murdering their own officers. With certain notable exceptions, the average US and Soviet infantryman proved at best mediocre, at worst useless. It was the inevitable result of their governments expecting reluctant conscript troops to fight in a war in which they could see no purpose.
Interestingly, the career officers of both armies saw the war differently from their men. It was for them an opportunity to further their careers. Many did this, punching their ticket with, for the Americans, a 6-month tour to gain combat experience. Something like 60,000 Soviet officers went through the Afghanistan War, thus qualifying for the Afghan Brotherhood, membership of which was so often rewarded with promotion and medals. I was now cast in the role of overall guerrilla leader. I ran over in my mind the recognized criteria normally necessary for an armed resistance movement to succeed. First, a loyal people who would support the effort at great risk to themselves. A local population, the majority of whom would supply shelter, food, recruits, and information. The Afghan people in the thousands of rural villages met this requirement. Second, the need for the guerrilla to believe implicitly in his cause, for him to be willing to sacrifice himself completely to achieve victory. The Afghans had Islam. They fought a jihad. They fought to protect their homes and families. Third, favorable terrain. With over 2/3 of Afghanistan covered by inhospitable mountains known only to the local people, I had no doubts about this. Fourth, a safe haven, a secure base area to which the guerrilla could withdraw to refit and rest without fear of attack. Pakistan provided the Mujahedin with such a sanctuary. Fifth, and possibly most important of all, a resistance movement needs outside backers who will not only represent his cause in international councils, but are a bountiful source of funds. The US and Saudi Arabia certainly fulfilled this role. General Akhtar had been right. The ingredients for military victory were all there. I needed to give careful thought to where and how to play the 1,000 cuts to bring down the bear.
During my early weeks, I met with General Akhtar several times to discuss an overall strategy for the war. In his view, 1984 would see the Soviets continue to adopt their generally defensive posture, with emphasis on protecting important political centers, lines of communication, and key installations such as airfields, dams, industrial sites, and hydroelectric plants. He foresaw the enemy confining any major operations to those necessary to increase security to the above vulnerable points. These would be likely in areas close to the Pakistan border to disrupt the Mujahedin supply routes and in Mujahedin operational base areas close to important cities or air bases such as Kabul and Bagram. The Panjshir Valley, see Map 7, which had so often been the springboard for attacks on the Salang Highway, and which had already been the target for no less than 6 major sweep operations in the first 3 years of the war, was considered the likely location of another Soviet offensive. Akhtar also anticipated the buildup of air and artillery violations across the border into Pakistan. He saw the desire to create a widening rift between the local Pakistani population and the refugees as a crucial part of Soviet strategy. Sabotage and subversion would continue to be used to destabilize Pakistan, and this would include the provision of arms and money to tribes in the frontier areas that had always been hostile to the central government at Islamabad. If a breakdown of law and order could be fomented, then it would put further pressure on Pakistan, which at this time meant President Zia, to withdraw its support for the jihad. We both agreed that the Soviets seemed wedded to a military defensive strategy in Afghanistan, aimed at holding what they had got, coupled with a sabotage offensive in Pakistan, aimed at making support for the Mujahedin too expensive politically for Zia. The Soviets seemed disinclined to raise the stakes with large-scale reinforcements, hoping that in the long run, the inability of the Mujahedin to capture key towns and the progressive destruction of the villages and rural infrastructure would make them give up the struggle through sheer war weariness. Our plans for 1984 were modest in their scope. They envisaged concentrating attacks on Kabul, which General Akhtar saw as the center of gravity of the communist regime and army.
It should be subjected to every type of assault and harassment to gain a political and psychological edge in the international press and media. Operations against the enemy's main line of communication and airfields were to be intensified, and attempts should be made to lure small garrisons out into the field so that they could be caught at a disadvantage. This was not an ambitious strategy, but, as I was quickly to appreciate, it took account of the limited capabilities of the Mujahedin at that stage of the war. There was still no real unity among leaders. The alliance was only just being set up. The military committee was in its infancy. The number of Mujahedin who had received training was tiny, and they possessed no effective answer to the helicopter gunship. It was only during that year that Chinese 107mm rockets started to arrive. Until then, the Mujahedin's artillery had been the 82mm mortar. Before I could do much to implement these decisions, a major offensive was launched up the Panjshir Valley. It was the seventh such attack and illustrated the critical importance of this valley to both sides. Map 7 makes clear its significance. It takes its name from the river that rises in the heart of the Hindu Kush amongst ice-capped peaks 20,000 feet high, and it points like a sword at the Salang Highway. The tip of the blade almost touches the road at Jabal Sarraj. This valley contained the operational bases of the Mujahedin commander Ahmad Shah Massoud. Massoud had agreed a ceasefire in the valley during 1983, but had refused to renew it for 1984, and this is what sparked the offensive. The winter of 1983-1984 had been a hard one, and we did not expect any large-scale offensive until May. Nevertheless, we started receiving reports via our informers in Kabul that a major attack was coming in the Panjshir Valley. I held hurried discussions with my staff and the military committee as to how we could best assist Massoud. Our problem was that the shortest supply route to Panjshir was through the northern passes of the Hindu Kush from Chitral, but these were snowbound, and on the other routes, commanders from different parties to Massoud would not allow supply trains through their area. It was my first experience of how these inter-party feuds could jeopardize operations. Massoud belonged to Rabbani's party, so I put a lot of pressure on Rabbani to swallow his pride and ask the others to assist and cooperate. Reluctantly, he did so, and I was relieved when Hikmatyar agreed, as his men were strong near the mouth of the valley overlooking Jabal Sarraj and Gulbahar, where we wanted to counterattack as the offensive moved up the valley. I also hurriedly briefed and trained as many Mujahedin as were available in Pakistan before dispatching them to undertake diversionary attacks on Kabul, Bagram, and in the Pakistan border regions. It was much, but time was against me, and there was no way I could coordinate any response to prevent the offensive getting underway. The Soviets achieved surprise with the timing, strength, and scope of their attack. Although we at ISI had insufficient time to organize an immediate response to the warning, Massoud was able to blunt the expected blow. He evacuated hundreds of villagers from the mouth and lower part of the valley into the side valleys. He laid mines along the road up the valley, and he blew up 2 important road bridges. On the same day, 20 April, he started to pull back his men, who numbered up to 5,000, into the mountains and side valleys. On the same day, the aerial bombardment started. 36 Tu-16 high-altitude bombers, Badgers, together with numerous Su-24 bombers, Fencers, had been pre-positioned from other parts of the Soviet Union to airfields at Mari North and Termez. The ground advance was to be preceded by high-level carpet bombing of the valley. The Badgers would be so high as to make them inaudible and invisible. On the people in the Panjshir, it suddenly started raining 500 and 1,000 Live bombs. as the Americans had found with their massive B-54 raids over Vietnam and the Allies in Northwest Europe in 1944-1945, aerial bombardment can be disappointing if its aim is to kill people or break their will to fight. So it was in the Panjshir, where Massoud forethought reduced casualties, while the poor weather hampered defenders and made one badger fly into a mountain. The narrow, steep-sided valleys offered excellent shelter from air attack. The mountains rose up to 19,000 feet in places. The tiny valleys twisted and turned, often becoming gorges rather than valleys, making such attacks extremely hazardous, if not impossible. In these areas, attacking aircraft could not make proper approaches to the target, and high-level bombing was usually wide of the mark. It was a lesson worth learning, and I made a mental note of the value of mountains against air attack. For the Soviets, this was their most ambitious offensive to date, reflecting the importance they attached to the Salang Highway and the Panjshir as a threat to its security. It is likely that Major General Saradov, the commander of the 108th MRD, was in charge of the operation, with a senior general from the General Staff flown in from Moscow to advise and report on progress. An airborne command post was set up in a 4-engined AN-12 Cub, which was packed with Soviet staff officers and nicknamed the Flying Kremlin. Under command were some 10,000 Soviet and Afghan troops, with casualties where they had to range from up to 400 per battle group.